And as we've looked at these miracles, we've seen that each and every miracle Jesus performed had a purpose. And of course, we know that every miracle he did ultimately had one purpose, and that was to show that he was the Messiah who had been foretold by the prophets. Every miracle helped bring that to the forefront. But each miracle also had other themes that went with it, other things he was trying to do. Some of them showed his power and his sovereignty over nature and over people. And over sickness, and other miracles had other purposes. Some were for the very purpose of setting the stage for his coming death. At other times, it was to teach an important lesson or to expand the work of God's kingdom into unexpected places, such as the miracles that took Jesus into the Gentile territories. But what is interesting is that every miracle we have looked at has been Jesus performing some type of positive action, some type of healing or positive thing. But this last miracle we're going to look at tonight is the only miracle during his earthly ministry where we can say, without a doubt, that Jesus causes physical harm in the performing of a miracle. I've kind of teased this for ever since last week and on Sunday morning, and many of you took a guess as to what this miracle might be. Some thought it might. Listen, this was a great guess. There were quite a few who thought this might be when Jesus blinded Paul on the road to Damascus, and that's a great guess. Unfortunately, for what we're looking at, that was after his ministry here on earth. That was kind of a separate part of that. And that was a temporary blindness as well that went with that. Others thought that it might be possibly when he cast the demon, when the demons went into the pigs and the pigs went off the cliff. But as you remember, a few weeks ago, we talked about that. And we saw that ultimately Jesus did not send the demons into the pigs. They requested, they asked, can we go into the pigs? And Jesus said, yes, you can. And then as soon as they entered the pigs, they are the ones who drove the pigs over the cliff. And so those are the only two that we could really think about that could possibly have been beyond what we're going to look at tonight. And so this miracle is really, in my mind, the only miracle where Jesus truly did harm, and that is in the cursing of the fig tree, which we find in two accounts in both Matthew and Mark. Every other miracle was an act of mercy, but this miracle is an act of judgment. And so, as we look at this, there are two accounts of this miracle in Scripture. Mark actually gives us the fullest account, and his account is actually the most accurate from a chronological standpoint. There we go. Matthew is less concerned about the timing of the events as he is reporting the whole account as one account, so you get the story beginning to end as one cohesive story. And so we're going to begin and we're going to take a look at it. So what I would like to do is look at these two passages. Let's go ahead and read them, and then we will dive into our message for tonight. So Matthew chapter 21, let's start there. Matthew chapter 21 and verses 18 through 22. It says, now in the morning as he returned to the city, he was hungry, and seeing a fig tree by the road, he came to it and found nothing on it but leaves, and said to it, let no fruit grow on you ever again. And immediately the fig tree withered away. And when the disciples saw it, they marveled, saying, how did the fig tree wither away so soon? So Jesus answered and said to them, assuredly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what was done to the fig tree, but also if you say to this mountain, be removed and be cast into the sea, it will be done. And whatever things you ask in prayer, believing, you will receive. All right, so there's the Matthew account. Let's turn over and let's look at the Mark account. Mark chapter 11. Mark chapter 11. And you can see on your notes that this is split into two sections. Verses 12 through 14 is the first part. Mark 11, verse 12. Now the next day, when they had come out from Bethany, he was hungry, And seeing from afar a fig tree having leaves, he went to see if perhaps he would find something on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. In response, Jesus said to it, "Let no one eat fruit from you ever again." And his disciples heard it. Now, drop down to verse 20 and through 24. Now, in the morning, as they passed by, they saw the fig tree dried up from the roots. And Peter, remembering, said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree which you cursed has withered away." So Jesus answered and said to them, "Have faith in God. For assuredly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, 'Be removed and be cast into the sea,' and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that those things he says will be done, he will have whatever he says. Therefore I say to you, whatever things you ask when you pray, believe that you receive them, and you will have them." All right. So we see these two passages, and we're going to go ahead. And the first thing I want us to do as we look at this miracle tonight is I want to focus on the setting of the miracle. What are the circumstances of this miracle? Because they are important. And the first is Jesus is traveling into Jerusalem. In Matthew's account, and listen, I'm going to reference some verses. I'm not really going to go back and read particular verses in whole. I may at one or two points, but I'm going to reference certain phrases from each of the two accounts. And so if you want to take notes of that, you can. But in Matthew's account, Matthew tells us that now in the morning, as he returned to the city, and Mark also makes the same notation. Let's explain what's happening. This miracle occurs during the last week of Jesus' life leading up to his crucifixion, okay? The day before this miracle, he had triumphantly entered Jerusalem on the back of a donkey. What do we call that particular Sunday? Palm Sunday, all right? So we're talking about this miracle is taking place on the Monday, the day after Palm Sunday. And so after he spent Palm Sunday in Jerusalem, he left for the night and he went back to Bethany. The next morning, Monday morning, Jesus journeys back from Bethany to Jerusalem for another full day of activity. This day of activity is going to include going in and cleansing the temple is going to be part of that. And it's also going to include the cursing of this fig tree. It's interesting to me that Jesus did not choose to stay in Jerusalem. He knows his death is coming in this particular week. He knows it's coming. And so why doesn't he stay in Jerusalem? He goes back to Bethany instead, which is 2 miles away. Listen, I don't know this for sure, but I think it tells us a little bit about the climate that existed in Jerusalem at the moment. I think it lets us know kind of what the political and religious climate was that was going on there. There were a lot of people in authority in Jerusalem who had a very hostile attitude towards Jesus. We can see that because in a few days they're going to shout, "Crucify," right? They do everything they can to get Jesus dead. And so in the city of Jerusalem, you could very much say he's on the wanted list. And so for him, he doesn't stay there. He goes back to Bethany. And as we know, Bethany is a place where Mary, Martha, and Lazarus live. Now, did he go back to Bethany and stay at Mary and Martha and Lazarus' house? Possibly. We don't really know for sure. But what it does seem to indicate is that the people of Bethany were much more welcoming of Jesus than the hardened hearts in Jerusalem. After all, the people in Bethany have just seen Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead. And so they've seen him, and they're still in awe at who he is and what he's done. But no matter what, Jesus has spent the night in Bethany on Palm Sunday, and now gets up Monday morning, and he's returning to Jerusalem, and both accounts tell us this next fact. And that is that Jesus was hungry. Nice, simple fact. Jesus was hungry. Here we get another wonderful picture of Jesus' humanity. We see his deity through everything. We see his deity in every single miracle and all the stuff that he does. But here we get a great picture of his humanity, as we've seen in a few of the miracles. Yes, he was God, but he was God in the flesh. meaning that he dealt with the same difficulties that plague us. He grew fatigued and tired, and he needed sleep, as we've already seen. He was so tired, he slept through hurricane-force storms out at sea. All right? He experienced the same things we do. Here in this story, in this instance, he becomes hungry, and he needs some nourishment for his body. Again, one of the things that we should realize in this miracle is that while we see his humanity, it does still show his deity as well. He comes to this tree, and we've already read the account, so we know the end. He curses the tree. He essentially kills this tree with his divine power. But do we ever stop and think he could have just as easily looked at the tree and immediately commanded it to produce fruit, couldn't he? He could have done either, but he chose to divinely kill the tree. All right, so we see that he was hungry. Now, why was Jesus hungry? Some people, I read some commentators who began to question and doubt, why was he hungry? And they began to give explanations. Maybe he was staying with Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, and he got up so early, he was so intent on getting back to Jerusalem that he just skipped breakfast. Others said, he probably didn't stay at the house. He stayed out in the region, and he just got up from the grass and started walking to Jerusalem. Listen, we don't know. No matter what, he started making the journey back, and somewhere along the journey, that stomach started growling. You know what it's like. You get in the car on your way to work or wherever you're going, and you feel that stomach, and you hear that stomach start growling. You're like, well, I better make a pit stop at McDonald's. Some of you. Anyway. So, he's hungry. The third thing we see here is Jesus encounters a deceptive fig tree. A deceptive fig tree. Let's look at Mark chapter 11 and verse 13. Notice this verse with me. And seeing from afar a fig tree having leaves, he went to see if perhaps he would find something on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. All right, so somewhere along this 2-mile journey, Christ's hunger caused him to begin to look for some fruit from a fig tree, which by all appearance should have had fruit. But there was no fruit on this tree. It had leaves, but no fruit. Now, from a distance, Jesus sees this fig tree, and he sees it is covered full of leaves. And so he approaches it to look for the fruit. This would be the perfect place for him to get some food and satisfy his hunger. And as we know, under the law, it was perfectly allowable for Christ to stop and eat any fruit that he found on this tree. But when he gets to it, he finds nothing but leaves. He comes expecting to find fruit, but it turns out the leaves were a lie. Now, to grasp this, we have to understand how a fig tree works. First, the fruit of a fig tree begins appearing on the tree before any foliage. So, in other words, the fruit begins before the leaves ever appear. All right, it'll have the little buds, it'll be there, and it'll begin to be there. But as the foliage and the leaves increase on the tree, the fruit that is already there begins to ripen. And so if you found a tree with a lot of leaves on it, that meant the tree was supposed to have ripe fruit underneath the leaves. All right, so this tree had a good enough cover of leaves that Jesus didn't just see it, he saw it from afar. It got his notice. It was so full of leaves and so full of life that he could see it from afar. He's like, that's where we need to go for fruit. But that coverage of leaves was a lie because there was no fruit anywhere. Now, some may give this tree an excuse because after all, Mark tells us, what does he tell us about it? He says it wasn't the season for figs, right? So why is he getting mad at the tree for not having figs when it's not fig season? Right? Isn't that kind of the first question that comes to mind? He's getting mad at this thing. I shouldn't say he's getting mad. He's judging and cursing this tree when it's not even the season. Well, understand, when it says that it wasn't the season for figs, that only meant this wasn't the normal time for figs to be there. Based on the way a fig tree works, Mark could have just as easily said, the time of leaves had not come either. See, it's not just that it wasn't the time of figs, it wasn't even the time of leaves. And so the issue isn't what time of year it is. The issue is this tree gave the appearance of producing something that it wasn't. That was the problem. Ultimately, this tree is a perfect description of a hypocrite. And that's exactly what Jesus had in mind with this miracle. The Pharisees and scribes were full of hypocrites. The hypocrite appears to be something he really isn't. Listen, this was the condition of the nation of Israel in Jesus' day. And sadly, it describes so much of Christianity today as well. The Israelites in Jesus' day, they professed to have what no one else had. But in reality, they were as empty and barren as every pagan nation around them. They had a lot of outward show. They had their rites. They had their ceremonies. They had all of their observances. They had a lot of people doing a lot of speaking. But there was no real devotion to God. There was no real righteousness. There was no heart worship, no good works. And so even though they professed a desire for the Messiah to come, they rejected Jesus when he finally did come. So when it came to spiritual matters, listen, the nation of Israel and the Pharisees and scribes, they were hypocrites. They were just a bunch of leaves with no fruit. But the same thing, I would say, can be said for much of what we call Christianity today. Many people today are in the same boat as the Pharisees and the fig tree. Lots of leaves, but no fruit. Think about the amount of church services that are very strong on show, but weak on substance. See, the more empty a church is spiritually, the more outward forms there will be. We see so many churches that fill themselves with ministers wearing their ornate robes, leading their congregations in high-sounding rituals and readings. Their sanctuaries are adorned with banners and candles, religious symbols and artifacts, all meant to inspire a religious feeling. But that's all there is. The people in reality are empty of true faith in Jesus. But I will say this, even more so, many of our own fundamental Bible-believing churches are following the same path. For a lot of our evangelical churches, show has begun to replace truth. Outward form, rituals, decorations have begun to replace a genuineness of heart. See, a lot of our churches today are just leaves with no fruit. Sure, the people coming may carry a big Bible, but is that Bible ever read or ever loved? They may pray a long prayer, but the heart is missing. It's leaves, but no fruit. And so that is the setting that we find for this miracle. So let's look at the second aspect, where we now get into the curse of the fig tree. Jesus goes about cursing the fig tree. Upon discovering this tree's true condition, Jesus, as we said, he could have told it to produce fruit. But instead, he looks at the tree and he pronounces a curse on the tree. This curse was a death sentence for this fig tree. I want you to notice a few things about this. First of all, the judgment occurred instantly. This judgment occurred instantly. Notice with me, look over in Matthew chapter... Ooh, I separated this the wrong way, I think. Matthew chapter 21. Matthew chapter 21, verse 19. Immediately the fig tree withered away. Look in verse 20. How did the fig tree wither away so soon? Is that right? Did I get the right verse on that? Yes, how did the fig tree wither away so soon? Both of those words, immediately and soon, come from the Greek word meaning instantly, as we see here, immediately. So this death sentence came to the tree immediately after Christ discovered there was no fruit on it. Herbert Lockyer said this. He said, "The stroke of judgment was swift, for immediately the tree dried up from its roots. Sudden destruction came to undo pretension." Sometimes God's judgment can come very swiftly, can't it? If you ever experienced God's judgment in your life, you've seen that sometimes when God finally brings the hammer down, it comes down quick, and when you're not ready for it. Sometimes we think, we look around at this world and we think that evil has gotten away with being evil. We think that it has somehow escaped God's judgment, that it has somehow overcome God's judgment. And we think that because we see, we think that because we see that it seems as if sin reigns supreme. We see people who where some of these sins just go on and on and on, and we feel like, man, why doesn't God just come down and lay judgment on these people who are living in this lifestyle of sin for years and years and years? And we don't understand it. But don't forget the words of 1 Thessalonians 5:3. It says, "For why they say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes upon them, as labor pains upon a pregnant woman, and they shall not escape." See, Paul tells us, says, listen, there's going to be a lot of people who are saying peace and safety. They're going to say, we're all good. I can live the way I want. Everything is fine. I can live this evil life. I can live this way, and I don't have to worry about it. And Paul says, listen, God's judgment is going to come. Sudden destruction will come upon them the same way that first labor pain comes upon the pregnant woman without her being ready for it. And it says, they shall not escape. It's going to come unexpectedly. The writer of Proverbs warns us in Proverbs 29:1, "He who is often rebuked and hardens his neck will suddenly be destroyed." And notice what this tree's judgment is. It is doomed to live with its condition. Notice again what verse 19 said in Matthew 21. It said, "Let no fruit grow on you ever again." What was this tree's great evil? It lacked fruit. The judgment that Jesus puts upon it is you'll never bear fruit again. You live in your sin, you're going to die by your sin, is basically the idea. You're going to suffer the judgment from that sin. Christ made the sin its own punishment. Think about it. How often does God punish us with the same coin that we sinned with? It's the simple principle of you reap what you sow, right? When you lie to get gain, don't be surprised if in God's judgment you lose what you gained by someone else's lie. If you cheat others, don't be shocked when you get cheated. God can bring judgment down very quickly, and for this tree, it came quickly and suddenly. But why? What was this tree's great sin that brought judgment upon it from Jesus so swiftly? The primary reason for this tree's judgment was hypocrisy. It was hypocrisy. Since it wasn't the normal fruit season, that means it wasn't because it lacked fruit. Jesus didn't curse the tree because it didn't have fruit. He cursed the tree because it made itself look like it had fruit. That was the issue. It was the deceptiveness of the tree, making it appear it had fruit when it really didn't. The fact that this tree had leaves, that it advertised to everyone who saw it, "Come to me, I've got fruit." That was the real problem. That was what provoked its death sentence. It was being judged for its hypocrisy. Listen to what God thinks about hypocrisy. Psalm 101, verse 7. It says, "He who works deceit shall not dwell within my house. He who tells lies shall not continue in my presence." Wow, that's a pretty strong statement, isn't it? He who works deceit shall not dwell within my house. He who tells lies shall not continue in my presence. Listen, if you are living a hypocritical life, This is why Jesus did this miracle, is to show us what happens if we continue living in this hypocritical life. If you're living that kind of life, now is the time to repent and get that right with God before His swift judgment comes. You may be deceiving others about what you are, but God is not fooled. The person who lives that hypocritical life will eventually discover that the hypocrite ends up deceiving himself more than others. We also see one other fact here, and that is this. The tree's judgment was final. It was final. Again, in Matthew 21:19, we saw it said, "Let no fruit grow on you ever again." In Mark 11:14, it says, "Let no one eat fruit from you ever again." These passages show us just how final the judgment on this tree was. First, this tree would never again bear fruit. Never. This tree lost its place of service within God's creation. It lost the very reason it was created to begin with. Its whole existence was for the purpose of providing figs. And Jesus tells this tree, you will never be able to provide figs ever again. You'll never be able to fulfill your purpose and serve the way God created you to. What a warning for God's people. Serving God is a privilege, and it is a blessing. But failure to serve, failure to fulfill what God has called us to do can result in the removal from our place of service. In this case, the tree's failure was hypocrisy. But for others, the failure is in not bearing fruit when they should be. Jesus spoke a warning of judgment on those who should be producing fruit, but fail to do so. John 15:2, Jesus said, "Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, He takes away." But it's not just doomed to never bear fruit again, this tree. No, Jesus' curse goes a step further. It will never even have leaves again. Notice again, Matthew 21:19 says, the fig tree withered away. Mark chapter 11, verse 20 says, the fig tree dried up from the roots. Listen, with this tree withered and dried up from the roots, there would be no leaves. This tree, in essence, has been judged and it has been condemned to say you'll never have fruit, but not only will you never have fruit, you'll never have leaves. But in that way, by never having leaves again, you will never be able to deceive another person into thinking you've got figs. You see the point here? He's making it clear. I'm going to make it so you can never deceive someone again. If the sentence on the tree had just been to never bear fruit, people would have kept going to it for figs, wouldn't they? They would have just kept going and going and going, and every one of them would walk away disappointed. See, the judgment upon the leaves to keep the tree from deceiving others reminds us, kind of in our society, of why the punishment of the crime isn't just for the criminal. When we punish a criminal, it's for the benefit of society. Because if the criminal isn't properly punished, he becomes a danger to society. The same is true with the hypocrite. If the hypocrite is allowed to go unpunished, if they are not exposed for what they are, then they can keep on deceiving people into coming to them instead of going to those who have the true source of life. Instead of going to the place where they can find sustenance that is found in Jesus Christ. Jesus is saying, listen, I'm not going to let the hypocrite continue. You stay as a hypocrite, and I'm going to cut you down to the point that you'll never deceive someone again. I'm not going to have you leading people away from me. Both Matthew and Mark tell us that this judgment on the tree was forever. This was a permanent sentence. This tree was never going to experience life and productivity again. That brings us to the third element of this miracle that we want to look at tonight, and that is the disciples' surprise. The disciples' surprise. We see over and over how the disciples are constantly surprised at what Jesus does and his ability to do those things. How many miracles have we seen where the disciples are shocked at what Jesus does? Almost everyone. Everything they have seen, and it still surprises them when Jesus does something miraculous. And the same thing happens here. They all, on Monday morning, as they're all heading to Jerusalem, they heard Jesus curse the tree. They all heard it. But none of them expected what came next. After Christ cursed the tree, he and his disciples continued on into Jerusalem, where he then went into the temple and cleansed the temple and engaged in other ministry. That evening, they returned back to Bethany. On that return trip, they would have passed the fig tree, but in the darkness of the evening, either they couldn't see it or they didn't pay it any mind because it was dark and they didn't even think about what had happened that morning. But then on Tuesday morning, as they make the next journey back to Jerusalem, full of daylight, they look and they're passing by the fig tree, and suddenly it catches their eye. Wait, it didn't look like that yesterday. What happened? Notice this first aspect here. They were surprised at the severity of the judgment. Mark chapter 11. Mark chapter 11, verses 20 and 21. Now in the morning as they passed by, they saw the fig tree dried up from the roots. And Peter, remembering, said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree which you cursed has withered away. The disciples, and specifically Peter here, Matthew says all the disciples doubted, but here specifically Peter, they were shocked that this entire fig tree had withered as it had. Now, fig trees, understand, can typically reach a height of around 20 to 25 feet. And because of that, they make absolutely great trees for giving shade. That's why Nathanael was sitting under a fig tree when he was first met Jesus. But in spite of the fact that a fig tree could be substantial enough to give shade as well as fruit, Christ still had the power to wither this tree simply by his word. You know, Christ did so many miracles in front of these disciples. And as I said, they're often so surprised. They quickly forget his power. We saw that last week in the miracle when, remember, he multiplied the food for the 4,000, and Jesus' disciples are shocked. They had forgotten all about the feeding of the 5,000. They seemingly forgot all about it. And it's easy for us to be critical of the disciples for completely forgetting everything Jesus has done. But if we're really honest with ourselves, don't we do the same thing in our lives sometimes? How often does Jesus do a great work in our life, and then when the next event comes along, we forget all about what Jesus did in the past? See, that's us. That was the disciples, and that's us. We forget just as much as the disciples did. And then when he works again for us, and God gets us through whatever it is we need to get through. Listen, this Sunday we're going to talk about facing giants. Every time we face that giant and God gives us the victory, we're suddenly surprised that God gave us the victory because we forgot all the victories he gave us before. Listen, we need to quit being surprised. They were surprised at the severity of the judgment, and when they look at it, it brings another thought to mind. They were surprised not just at the severity, they were surprised at the speed of the judgment. They were surprised at the speed. Back in Matthew chapter 21, verse 20, it says, "And when the disciples saw it, they marveled, saying, 'How did the fig tree wither away so soon?'" So quickly. How did it die so quickly? Yes, they were shocked at the fact that Jesus was able to completely kill this tree at just his word. But they were just as shocked at how quickly it occurred. Think about it. How many of you ever cut down a tree, or you've cut off some limbs or whatever? You cut down a tree, does that thing die right away? The leaves on it will stay green for a few days, won't they? Yeah, absolutely. And so understand, they're looking at this, and it's completely dead. It's withered. It doesn't show any signs of life. Have you ever seen a tree do that in a less than 24-hour period? They're amazed at the power of Jesus and the severity of it, but they're amazed at the speed of it. In Mark's text, the fig tree didn't just die the moment Jesus spoke. It shriveled up and became this obviously dead tree within a 24-hour period. Imagine walking by a tree and seeing it bursting with life and leaves on one day, and the next day it's completely empty of every leaf, and it just looks like a lifeless husk. You see, the speed with which Jesus enacted the judgment on this tree helped the disciples see the divine miracle in this judgment. If that tree had slowly withered over time, over a period of a week like normal trees do, the disciples wouldn't have thought anything of it, would they? But the speedy judgment showed them that God was at work. Interestingly, after their shock, Jesus gives his disciples a little sermonette. This little sermonette that we read, it's not on hypocrisy, is it? We might expect it to be on hypocrisy because the tree represents the hypocrite, and it represents the judgment that comes on them. But instead, Jesus gives the disciples another lesson on faith. Because of their reaction to their miracle, and because it had been one of astonishment at the power of Christ, he chose to use this moment to try to increase their faith yet again. Because the cross is just a few days away. Very soon, they're going to see Jesus placed on a tree. They would see Jesus die. And they were going to need some strong faith to believe that Jesus' death wasn't final. And so we see this cursing of the fig tree, and that is our last miracle that we're going to take a look at. Next week, the book of Daniel.